Okay, good morning and welcome. Let me just move, there we go. Welcome to the inaugural National Community Violence Initiative and Prevention Initiative Resource and Field Support Center webinar, Catalyst for Change, Approaches to CVIPI. Throughout today's webinar, helpful links will be provided in the chat box. Please submit your questions. Please submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box found at the base of your Zoom screen. The webinar will be recorded and will be available online afterwards. Captions are available and can be turned off using the menu at the base of your screen. Please join this conversation through social media using the hashtag CVI Strengthening Communities. And please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, organization, and location. In a few minutes, we will hear from Amy Solomon, Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Justice Programs, and Eddie Bocanegra, Senior Advisor in the Office of the Assistant Attorney General. We will then transition to setting the foundation of this initiative by defining CVI, the essential elements, and the guiding principles. We'll then have a panel discussion with experts that will talk about what makes this work unique, highlighting CVI-PI's focus on people and place. We will then share opportunities for you to engage the National CVIPI Resource and Field Support Center, leaving time to address your questions. With that, I am very privileged to introduce the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Justice Programs, Amy Solomon.
Great. Thank you, James. I'm so excited to join you today. I want to thank you and the whole team at LISC for hosting this webinar series and for being such a terrific partner through the years. My deepest thanks to our amazing panelists too. These are leading lights in the CVI field who have carved out the time today to share their expertise with all of you. And thanks to everyone who's joined us online today for this important session. The Office of Justice Programs is one of the Justice Department's key connection points to communities throughout the country. Our mission, our responsibility is to work with leaders like all of you to advance community safety, to build bridges of trust, and to strengthen the community's role as co-producer of safety and justice. We know that gun violence is one of the toughest challenges facing many Americans today, and meeting this challenge depends heavily on the expertise and the credibility of people with lived experience, like so many of you joining us today. Eddie Bocanegra, our Senior Advisor for Community Violence Intervention, brings that credibility and brings your voice to our work every day. He is a driving force on CVI here at OJP, and you will hear from him next. Now, in fiscal year 22, the Justice Department launched the Community-Based Violence Intervention and Prevention Initiative. This is a landmark federal grant program designed to support community-driven solutions, and it draws from resources and expertise available through our Bureau of Justice Assistance, our Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and the Office for Victims of Crime. The Office of Justice Programs is proud to administer this program, which represents an unparalleled federal commitment to this work. Investments support evidence-informed CVI strategies that strengthen safety by interrupting patterns of violence in the lives of the highest risk individuals. Now, we're taking an approach that is community-driven, it's community-centered, and it is equity-focused. As a result of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which became law thanks in great part to CVI champions and leaders, $250 million has been dedicated to CVI over 5 years, along with our annual appropriations. So over the last 2 years, the Office of Justice Programs has awarded almost $200 million to 80 CVI sites around the country. And while there is consistency in the program's mission, there is great diversity in its approach. Many of these grants are going to community-based organizations, others are going to city-led collaboratives, and 4 are going to states with multiple CVI locations. Of the 29 sites funded last year, about 2/3 have established partnerships with local law enforcement. 1/4 are engaging with prosecutors' offices, and 1 in 5 are implementing hospital-based violence interventions. More than 1/4 of the newly funded projects include a focus on supporting victims of violent crime. Now, we're also supporting 7 organizations with deep expertise and credibility in the CVI space to serve as intermediaries to smaller CVOs. These larger organizations provide both funding and hands-on technical assistance to help smaller, community-rooted agencies access resources and build their capacity to grow and sustain their work in the long term. We know that these smaller CVOs have deep ties to the community and are often in the best position to deliver high-impact interventions. So we're excited about this new approach, and we'll continue to expand these microgrant opportunities this year. We are so proud to support this work and so pleased to see the progress that is unfolding. But this is just the beginning. We know that there is much more to do to meet the moment, and in the coming weeks, we are going to post more funding opportunities to grow the CVI field and to support many other public safety efforts too. In fact, just last week, the Justice Department announced what we call our program plan for fiscal year 24. And this forecasts more than 200 anticipated funding opportunities designed to strengthen community safety, improve justice system outcomes, and to grow the evidence base through research and evaluation. The program plan is a searchable database of solicitations that we expect to release this spring, pending congressional funding. You can find it on ojp.gov, and we hope that this is a great resource for you and your home communities. Now, here is another resource. Working hand in hand with our partners at LISC, we have just launched a resource center that will allow CVI professionals across the country to access knowledge-building resources and training and technical assistance, whether you're a grantee or not. Through these efforts, we are aiming to build on the tremendous momentum that CVI professionals like you have helped to generate. The larger vision here is to grow and strengthen the CVI ecosystem so that it is a robust part of the public safety infrastructure in jurisdictions across the country. CVI leaders have shown us what's possible when we elevate credible messengers, when we build bridges of cooperation and trust among community sectors, and when we set our sights on reducing trauma, expanding opportunity, and saving lives. You are in a position to do so much good in your communities, and we are beyond grateful for your deep commitment, compassion, skills, and the integrity with which you approach this deeply important and impactful work. So thank you again for joining us. Enjoy the webinar, and we appreciate you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assistant Attorney General Solomon, for your remarks, but more importantly, for your commitment for CVI and public safety. We wouldn't be where we are right now without your leadership, and we're just grateful that you're here. I'm also noticing quite a bit of folks who are chiming in on the chat, on the, representing your names in cities, and it's incredible just to see the breadth of the magnitude in terms of like where people are calling from or joining us from. And so I just want to express gratitude for that, particularly on Monday. I also want to thank all those who are tuning in for the first time, and for some the second, third time. This is a platform that perhaps you're too familiar with, but we're also grateful that you're joining us for today's webinar. But regardless, many of us who are joining here today are in the business of restoration, and we are helping to restore people and communities to what they were really intended to be. In just a moment, you will hear from 3 extraordinary people who have dedicated their lives in helping to see and bring out the best in a population that is often misunderstood. Today's webinar is moderated by a really good friend, James Stark, who will help us ground our work in the fundamentals of CVI. It's important that I highlight this notion of fundamental CVI because regardless of how many decades we've been doing this work, this is the very first time, as Amy pointed out, that the federal government is really investing on this work. And so while it's $200 million to date that we've been able to invest and more to come, we also recognize that it's still, by all means, still building the foundation for this work and hoping that it'll outlive many of us here today. So building on the Assistant Attorney General's comments, I'll take a moment to share some reflections from the field. In the last couple of years, the Assistant Attorney General Amy Sullivan and I and others have visited various cities across the U.S. And in fact, this Friday, we were fortunate enough to witness an amazing group of leaders being hosted at the White House as they are advancing their career, their leadership to help expand and solidify CVI. But at the at the Office of Justice Programs, we're embracing a mission focused on advancing community safety, building community trust, and as the AAG, Amy Sullivan says, strengthening the community's role as co-producers of safety and justice. The importance of TTA, which is fundamentally one of the areas we want to continue to advance, is one of the areas that we see us being intentional in building out. And one of the ways that we get to do that is through, for example, this webinar. But we're also doing, as Amy Sullivan pointed out, a number of different things, whether it's webinars or links or having our TTA providers provide you direct service, whether you're a current grantee or someone that wants to apply for these resources. We want to make sure that you have visibility to our current grants that are coming, but that you're also in the best position to apply for these grants. The other thing that I want to mention, the importance and something that we take away from these 2 years of being here in this position is as while I emphasize that CVI is a necessary component of public safety ecology, we also must recognize that CVI practice cannot meet all the needs of the people we are working with. Our programs and organizations operate in communities impacted by racism and structural disinvestments that has affected all aspects of their lives, from healthcare to education access. CVI practitioners must aim to collaborate with others in the community so that we can meet their needs and get to the root causes of violence. We cannot be an island. We need to be an oasis. The other thing that I would say that I've taken away from these visits is the need to continue to research the field, centering race and equity in CVI practice and violence reduction outcomes. Just as how programs has been chronically underfunded in this field, so has research. We need the researchers here to uplift the knowledge and impact of the field in their work, which ultimately is really helping to elevate your voice. We also need to take care of each other and take care of ourselves. Wellness has been brought up quite a bit, and if we don't take the time to think about how we are managing our past trauma, our current trauma, and the collective trauma, then we will spill out our pain in our heart onto each other. And this is just one of several ways that we can do more harm than good. So our hope is that we continue to support the organizations that are on the ground doing this work by ensuring that you are able to leverage these resources to support your staff and to think about other creative ways of lifting the needs of your staff. In closing, just want to express gratitude on behalf of all of us at DOJ, at OJP, from our working group, from those who are providing CTA support, and just thank you for trusting us to be in this journey with you. On that note, I want to pass it to our colleague, James Stark, who's going to lead us to a discussion. Thank you, James.
And thank you, Amy and Eddie. You and your teams within the Office of Justice Programs understand the many complexities of and opportunities presented by this incredible investment the federal government is making that changes the culture of safety strategy development within communities impacted by the violence of trauma. Communities across the country benefit from your vision, leadership, and passion for this work. Now, before we bring on our esteemed panel, I want to take a few minutes to make sure we are all reading from the same sheet of music. To start, we know that there are people, organizations, group of folks, wherever there is violence, committed to stopping violence. It could be a mother whose pain drives her passion for this work, a doctor in a hospital who has seen too many victims come through their emergency room, or someone that has seen firsthand the impact of violence. Serve their time and use those lived experiences to change the trajectory of situations that without their intervention would have likely led to violence. When they all work together and work with a larger community, we create community violence intervention. So while this work is not new, the term community violence intervention is new. Similarly, formal research on CVI is only in its infancy. As a result, many organizations, cities, and communities have seen and are using a number of varied definitions for this work, causing confusion in the field. To support the deployment of federal CVIPI resources to the field, OJP, led by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, worked to create a common definition, essential elements, guiding principles, and a checklist tool to help sites conceptualize best practices for planning and implementing a federally funded CVIPI approach. To create this working definition, OJP engaged its internal team of CVI experts and it sought outside support from training and technical assistance partners, community violence intervention organizations, and researchers throughout the country. This definition went through a number of changes as these partners collectively provided key input and feedback prior to its release. Every word was scrutinized. You'll see several keywords highlighted in blue that I want to briefly address. But first and foremost, I hope one of the key takeaways you get from this webinar is the focus on community. You may be a newly created agency doing violence intervention work or one that has been around for decades. Your neighborhood might have one or several organizations focusing on violence intervention. But to do CVI work requires people and organizations to work in community. No community-based agency, police department, school, or neighborhood group can be solely responsible for this work. So diving into this definition, first I want to highlight the word approach. CVI is not a singular strategy or model. We understand it may start that way in your community due to resource capacity challenges. But as CVI efforts evolve over time, it must take on a yes and approach that addresses the multi-contextual challenges that lead to community violence. We were intentional to use the term evidence-informed strategy rather than evidence-based strategy. As mentioned earlier, research in this field is only in its infancy, so CVI should be tailored to each community and to each neighborhood. This is a central element of what makes CVI different from other safety strategies. This can and will look different in jurisdictions throughout the country. Another critical element is the importance of collaboration and partnerships. CVI does not push a single model or organization to lead efforts. Rather, it requires data to prioritize the people and places to direct resources. And it requires the right partners that are credible in the community to build, create, and maintain relationships with individuals closest to the violence. These intentional and consistent relationships create opportunities to stop violence and to connect these individuals with the holistic supports they need when they are needed. As this team at OJP pulled together and finalized the CVIPI definition, we quickly realized that there are several essential elements required in communities engaging in CVI. First, representatives of the affected communities must be full and equal partners who provide input and guidance in the interventions approach. Second, trusted, credible messengers and practitioners must deliver key intervention elements. They often have direct links to individuals at the highest risk of experiencing or perpetrating community violence and have built connections to intervene, turn down the heat, and ultimately diffuse violence. Third, data from multiple sources that are vetted for racial, ethnic, economic, or other biases to inform the approach, thereby ensuring CVI personnel and financial resources are identifying and serving individuals and groups with the highest likelihood of being involved in, exposed to, and victims of violence. Fourth, CVI strategies must be trauma responsive and incorporate the needs and perspectives of those impacted by community violence. CVI programs must recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others, and fully integrate knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. And fifth, community violence does not happen in a vacuum. CVI works to create racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic equity through the inclusion of cross-sector stakeholders, public health, housing, safety, education systems, as well as foundation and businesses, all of which have a role to play to ensure the growth and sustainability of this work. And as you build and evolve your CVI approach, these four things are things that should be your North Star and guiding principles. First, community-centered. CVI approaches must be guided by community residents and stakeholders, and everyone involved must prioritize the needs of the community. Second, equity and inclusion focused. Community members most affected and disenfranchised must be included in CVI solutions so that they can also benefit from these solutions. Third, it must be evidence informed. CVI approaches should be based on a wide array of evidence, so it is tailored to address the challenges specific to your community. And fourth, it must be effective and sustainable. CVI approaches must demonstrate measurable impacts on violence and community well-being. Now, I covered these rather quickly, and our panel in a few moments, they're going to dive a little bit more deeper into all of these things. But for more information, please engage us through our CVIPI website. We'll be dropping that link into the chat. You can also check this QR code. You can also utilize the CVIPI implementation checklist and watch OJP's CVIPI webinar series. And we'll be dropping those links into the chat as well. Now I want to introduce our panel. First, I want to introduce Dr. Shani Buggs. She is a public health injury and violence prevention researcher and an assistant professor in residence in the emergency medicine at the University of California, Davis. And he's got me thinking about Chicago. As a core faculty with the California Firearm Violence Research Center at UC Davis, Dr. Buggs' experience includes community-level firearm violence prevention programs and policies, transformative first response strategies, and comprehensive approaches to creating community safety through policies and programs at all levels of government. Dr. Buggs has worked with leaders across the United States to help coordinate and advise violence prevention efforts. She has secured federal, state, and private funding to lead research projects intended to inform policies that research health disparities, promote equity, safety, and well-being for families and communities. She has also conducted evaluations of state-level firearm policies and community violence intervention and prevention efforts. In her research, Dr. Buggs strives to center the experiences of those most impacted by violence to inform policies that foster equity, safety, and well-being for families and communities. In 2021, she was named the inaugural California Wellness Foundation Fellow in recognition of her commitment to high-quality and community-centered violence research. She is also the founder and board co-chair of the Black and Brown Collective, a multidisciplinary network organization of underrepresented firearm prevention scholars who are committed to centering community solutions to gun violence. Next are Brent Decker. Brent has been with Cure Violence since March 2003. He has worked with a wide range of U.S. and international partners to adapt, train, and provide ongoing technical assistance on the implementation of the Cure Violence model. Brent's focus has been on the development of systems to adapt, train, and implement the model to contexts outside of Chicago. The areas where Brent has worked with Cure Violence include Chicago, Baltimore, New York, New Orleans, Philadelphia, Kansas City, Honduras, Colombia, Iraq, Trinidad and Tobago, South Africa, Kenya, and England. Brent holds an MPH in International Public Health and Development and an MSW in Clinical Social Work from Tulane University. Before joining Cure Violence, Brent worked on a number of public health and social justice projects throughout Central and South America. And James Timpson, JT. For over 20 years, JT has developed extensive expertise in leadership and violence prevention initiatives. JT previously helped drive the successful expansion of Roca Baltimore as a founding director and has now joined the Roca Impact Institute as managing director of community violence initiatives. He serves as a subject matter expert on building community partnerships, safety and risk mitigation, understanding brain science, trauma, and behavior change interventions. In his role, JT oversees and scales the Roca Impact Institute's training and coaching initiatives with community violence intervention programs across the country. He cultivates strategic partnerships and fosters national visibility for Rewire CBT as an individual behavior and systems change strategy. JT's passion and experience extend well beyond his work at ROCA. He currently serves as a committee member for the Baltimore Mayor's Cabinet for Boys and Young Men of Color. JT also serves as an advisor for the Johns Hopkins Innovation Fund and the Accountability Board Selection Committee for Johns Hopkins University. He is a two-time panelist on the gun violence for the Amnesty International annual meeting. And in 2021, he was awarded Hometown Hero for gun violence by Amnesty International. Welcome to this esteemed group. And right now I'm going to take off the screen share so we can have a good conversation. Welcome, panel. First to Brent, and I've said this a couple of times, that community violence intervention is a fairly new term, but the work is not new. For you, Brent, having contributed to this work for decades, what makes CVI work different from quote unquote traditional violence reduction strategies often employed in communities?
Great. Well, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. And James, thanks for the great overview. I think you hit a lot of probably the main points that we'll go a little bit deeper on throughout the conversation. And I think first and foremost, what makes it different from traditional kind of thinking around violence and violence prevention is like the framing of the issue, right? How do we see or understand violence? And so, I think a lot of the early work that was done in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s about violence prevention, either from a health perspective, a public health perspective, or a community perspective, was really different from a lot of the ways that cities were thinking about it, right? Namely in the idea of kind of like needing to have kind of more suppressive tactics, like the way to deal with violence really was a question of law enforcement alone. And that might not have been how a city articulated it, but that's many times, oftentimes, like how resources were devoted to this issue. And so I think, when we really understand this from a health or a community lens, we think about some of the stuff that Eddie mentioned, some of the systematic and historical context. From a health perspective, we think about exposure to violence and the effect that has on young folks. We think about this issue of trauma and how that then also affects folks' kind of long-term outcomes. And so I think the framing of how we even see and understand the issue kind of starts from a different point than maybe what some traditional thinking about the issue has been. And I think that's really important because then that asks us, okay, well, if this is how we're understanding it, what do we do about it, right? What additionally can we do to address the issue? And that kind of leads us to like, who is best suited to do this work? And you mentioned on the previous slide, this issue of like credible messengers. And this issue of credible messengers, or in our mind, community health workers, like dates back almost through the centuries, right? Really in terms of like who is best suited to engage folks on an issue. And of course, it's individuals that come from or have affinity from those same communities, right? And this is, I think, again, is a newer idea in terms of violence prevention, in terms of like what has traditionally been thought of it. It's not necessarily just for the teachers and social workers to do, right? Or law enforcement. It's really about how do we center community groups, folks who have those type of connections to those who are likely to go in violence. So like the who does the work, I think is also what's different about it. And oftentimes it's, when we think about CVI work, it's community groups, it's individuals like that Eddie mentioned have kind of been there and done that, and that's a critical component of it. But then the next question I think that makes a difference, like where to do the work, right? Like, and I think when we think about CVI, this issue of really looking at the data to understand, okay, where are the hot spots to start the project and where do we really need to focus on? And that's not to neglect other areas, but it's like really trying to get down to what are the areas that we need to best support to do this work. And I think in the CVI world, it's both official data, right? So like law enforcement data, which is important, hospital and health department data, but it's also this issue of community data. And I say that because oftentimes when we're starting in new cities or new jurisdictions or new countries, the question of like, what does this data mean and how is it understood and what does it really say? From a community perspective, for folks who are living in it every day, was previously kind of left out of a lot of the conversation. I mean, thankfully that's changed a lot. Like, how do we even understand this? How do we really understand the dynamics? Because oftentimes official categorizations of stuff don't really do justice to what's going on, right? And then I think the other distinction from traditional stuff is like, who do we work with and how, right? And so oftentimes when we, traditionally we think about violence prevention, a lot of focus was like on early childhood stuff, which is super important. And you would never hear us say, don't do that, but really shifting some of the resources and shifting some of the approach to really dealing with folks that are most likely to be involved in violence, like today, tomorrow, next week, next month, like you kind of said in the intro. And so I think that's like, a very critical aspect of it. And oftentimes this is a part of the community that's been, kicked out of every other program, have experienced many times the highest levels of trauma, experienced many times the worst that this country has in terms of prison systems, et cetera, et cetera. And we're not going to get into all that right now, but that really trying to work with and support folks that are at highest risk to be involved in violence in a non-judgmental way, in a supportive way, in an empowering way. And so this is, I think, getting to the frame, who does the work, where do we work, and then, who do we work with? And I think the other element of who do we work with is like the modality of engagement, right? And that I think a lot of the very exciting work that's been done by many folks on this call, I've seen a bunch of the names pop up as participants were joining, and as well as my colleagues on the panel is really not being like, understand where folks are coming from and supporting them and not seen as like, just someone that needs to be pushed to do something or not do something. It's really about supporting folks and working with folks in a real way, and I think the other component of the CVI stuff that's a little bit different than some of the traditional stuff is like thinking about how do these things intersect a little bit, like you said, you know what I mean? That it's like we have those that are at highest risk to be involved in violence, kind of the top of the triangle in terms of a health lens. But what are some of the more community-wide efforts that need to be placed? And then almost most importantly, this issue of like, what are some of the systematic changes that really need to be changed to kind of help to really sustain some of these reductions. So I think this is kind of some of the themes, and I don't want to talk too much, we got a lot to cover, but I think that really kind of shift. And the last thing I'll say that I think is the most important thing is that I think the CVI perspective is there's something actually can be done. Like we can do something about it today, tomorrow, next week. It doesn't have to wait, 20 years. Is it going to take a long time? Yes, but we can see impact. We can support folks like today and tomorrow. And I think it has a message of hope, and we've been able to see that. And I think that's very important. So that was my very brief answer to your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Brent. That was great. No, I appreciate that. I want to pivot now to JT. The organization that you work with started in Chelsea, Massachusetts, but is now located in several places across the country, including your city and Ray Lewis's city behind you there, the Jersey, Baltimore. Tell us a little bit about ROCA's approach as it enters communities impacted by violence. Does it all look the same, or does it look different when you go into different communities?
So good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to share. So no, it never looks the same. We know we're facing the same issue in most of the cities that we go in, or similar issues, I should say. Poverty, racism, systematic issues, police issues in some cities, governmental issues, and stuff. Like some of the issues across the cities are all the same. But the approach has to be different. We actually offer tools, right? So our approach is our Rewire CBT. So when we first started the program, we knew that we had to do something to help young men and young women who are at the highest risk really focus on their behavior change. So let me start there. So what we do, we're a behavior change model. We work 4 years intensively with our young people to try to promote the behavior change, which is different from a lot of programs. Here's what we know. The brain science tells us, and our trauma-informed approach and through brain science, which is stuff that when I first met Brent, I probably would have never talked about, or when I met Dr. Buggs, I wasn't talking about brain science, doc, but I understand how important it is now, right? And with that approach, we've been able to build a program that really helps focus on trauma. And it's really about the trauma that the young people that come into our program have endured throughout their lifetime and continue to endure, that we have to help address. because we can give them programs, we can give them resources all day. But if that trauma level is too high, they'll never be able to take advantage of them because they're just not sustainable. They're not consistent, or their brain isn't where they need to be able to take advantage of those resources and services. So our motto is built around how do we really directly service those young people who are really at the highest risk. Those are the ones that we expect to get kicked out of programs. If you can show up at my front door on time, then you're not a fit for the program. Because that means that you're more than likely ready, willing, and able. We want the young people who can't show up, who don't show up, who won't show up. Because those are the ones, at least in a lot of our communities, are the ones that you have to worry about driving violence. We've all heard the saying, idle mind is the devil's playground, right? Well, if kids not going to school and they're not being engaged positively in other things, then how do we engage them? We need to go where they are and engage them where they are. That's our approach. Our approach is we go find young people where they are. We build transformational trust and relationships with them. Because one of the things we know is everything you ask a young person to not do, you have to have something else for them to do. So if I'm asking you to put a gun down, what's next? It's not enough for me to preach to you about the bad stuff that'll happen, or because we done been through that and we done seen it all our lives. So that stuff doesn't affect us, right? It's about what can you sustainably tell me that's going to help me shift this behavior, right? Well, let me help you understand what's happening to you. Because for the first time in your life, you may understand that you're not crazy. You're not labeled. You're not all these labels that you've been told, right? You're actually a young person who suffers from a high level of trauma. So what we do is through our Rewire CBT, we really focus on 7 skills, and we call them the 7 life-saving skills, where we teach young people behavior change, right? And it's really about helping them learn how to recognize their trauma and address their trauma and hopefully change their behaviors. Now, what we do with other cities, because after we opened in Baltimore in 2018, we decided that replication to other cities was going to be a little difficult if we were trying to do the full direct service model. What we know is that we do have a tool that's very helpful, and that's the Rewire CBT. So what we can do is go to other cities, or what we've done, we started the Roca Impact Institute around that time to be able to take this tool, listen to cities that we go into, listen to what cities that we go into, tell us that they need, listen to communities, tell us what they need, and we take our tool and help figure out how do we implement this into a community that is going to best serve you. Not what I thought coming in, not what somebody nationally who don't live in your city is telling me, but what you tell me, right? How do we take this tool and implement it in a way that is going to help benefit you and what your city needs, right? So we have been successful in that, because the flip side to it has been we use this tool to train frontline workers how to teach young people behavior change. So let me tell you about the tool really quick. It's designed by Roca and Mass General Hospital. It was designed to be done by frontline workers, not licensed clinicians. That's why it's called Rewire CBT, Rewire Cognitive Behavioral Therapy instead of theory. Because again, therapy has to be taught by licensed clinicians. We wanted this to be taught by people who we've been talking about all along, credible messages, those who are in the community, those who have the most proximity to the young people, who can get them to actually maybe use this tool, right? So we designed it to be taught by frontline workers. The catch is that what we started noticing was the effect that it was having on the workers. Because a lot of time we come into this work so highly traumatized, haven't gotten no support, no training, no nothing, just thrown out there and say, hey, go save the world. Go save your community, go save this neighborhood. And our friends die, our families die, and then we don't get the support that we need to deal with that stuff. So this tool has been great in helping the workers actually sustain their shelf life in work and be able to do the work for longer periods of time, because trauma is real. We all suffer from trauma. But until we make an effort in this workforce to help make our workers healthy enough to be able to sustain doing this work, we're not getting the point. Because not many people can do this. Everybody can't do this. This ain't the work for the many. This is the work for the few. But we have to make sure that the few are healthy enough to be able to continue to do the work. So addressing trauma that we suffer as workers doing this work and the trauma of the community is so important. That's why our theory of how we operate, sure, is the same. But what we do when we go into a city is individualized, because I need to hear your story so that I can help make this tool what you need for your city and your communities. We could be in the same city teaching it different or operating different in different neighborhoods because that's what that neighborhood needs, right? It's about a community approach. And community means what people tell us they need, not what we think they need. So we tailor it city by city, neighborhood by neighborhood, person by person, group by group. However we need to tailor it, that's how we tailor it, because we know that a one-size-fits-all approach in every city, every place is just not going to work.
JT, always bringing so many useful nuggets, man. Appreciate that. Shawnee, sorry, you have to follow JT. And sorry for this very long preamble. It's a very long, complicated question, but your research on this topic in papers like implementing outreach-based community violence intervention programs, thank you for your work on that with LISC, has lifted up this work and highlighted a number of operational needs and policy recommendations that can support and sustain this work. Stepping back from how this work is being done, let's talk a little bit about the why of this work. You've written that community violence is rooted in poverty, trauma, racial capitalism, and white supremacy. We can reference generations of decisions that have historically limited access to social goods and capital, creating unequal access to stability and opportunity in housing, health, education, and employment. I really appreciated the quote from one of the CVI leaders you interviewed that said, and I'm paraphrasing, that these ongoing conflicts are not about money or territory, but at their root, they are about pain and grief and rage. Historically, strategies to address violence are short-term approaches, but don't seem to address the why of community violence. Can you talk about your work in this field and how CVI is uniquely positioned to address the many whys that can lead to community violence?
Thank you for the question. And yeah, why did we agree for me to go after Brent and JT? I'm not sure. I really thank you all for being here. Thank you to the DOJ, BJA, Assistant Attorney General Solomon, Senior Advisor Bocanegra, LISC, James, all of the attendees. And before I get started, I cannot talk about this without thanking my incredible fellow panelists who, like thousands of community violence intervention and prevention professionals, give so much of themselves every day on behalf of peace and community and love and hope, and without whom we would not be here talking about community-based violence intervention today. I started my work and research in the community violence prevention space in Baltimore while completing my graduate studies in public health and public policy. And during that time, I also worked in the Baltimore mayor's office, helping to coordinate the city's violent crime reduction strategies. In that role, I was tasked with meeting with stakeholders from across the city, city agency leaders, police, state's attorney representatives, health department leaders, heads of community organizations, and residents. And I quickly became aware of a major disconnect in the public safety approach in Baltimore at that time. I met with hundreds of residents who were disproportionately impacted by community violence, or who lived in communities that were disproportionately impacted. And when we talked about what safety meant to them and what the city needed to do to increase safety, the residents talked about elected and appointed officials' inaction to address the poor conditions in their communities, and about their desire not for anyone to come save them, but to remove the barriers for them to live and thrive the way that they saw was necessary to take care of their families. I continuously heard about the systematic disinvestment in their mostly poor and mostly Black neighborhoods, from redlining to failure to replace jobs after the manufacturing industry declined, to mass incarceration and the multitudes of violence that occurs in the criminal legal system. I continuously heard about the severe lack of healthy development opportunities and safe spaces for young people, the dearth of tangible and intangible supports for parents and families, the disturbing rates of poor educational attainment and literacy in schools, the unaffordability of healthcare, the many barriers to obtaining employment with living wages, particularly for those embroiled in the criminal legal system, and even the high prevalence of food and housing insecurity. And what I heard from Baltimore residents is what I've heard from residents and violence prevention professionals in cities nationwide, from coast to coast, from small towns to cities with populations in the millions. And there is ample research to show that every one of those factors increases the risk of violence. I also heard account upon account upon account of people's exposures to harm and to violence and to neglect and loss. And one of the strongest predictors of future violence involvement, either as someone who was harmed or as someone who commits harm, is past exposure to violence. And many of the people I spoke to had suffered immensely from successive traumatic experiences, and resources to addressing their healing needs were virtually nil. The violence that people were experiencing wasn't always coming from other residents either. Often it was coming from the systems that we are told to rely on for safety and security. Residents talked frequently about too many police and not enough actual safety. They talked about police humiliation and harassment, about police shootings and misconduct, about legal system injustices. But when I spoke to city leaders, by and large, they talked about the role of policing and prosecution as the epicenter of public safety. So there was this huge misalignment between what people most directly impacted by community violence were saying that they needed to curb the underlying drivers of violence, and what nearly all of the leaders responsible for directing the responses to that violence were actually doing and actually offering to the people who were most impacted. And the people in communities impacted by violence were frustrated and disengaged in government because they felt ignored and gaslit and devalued over and over again. And these systematic disconnects are echoed in the research literature as well. Research shows that of individuals who go on to engage in violent harm in their communities, as has been said already, the majority of those individuals and their families were touched and ultimately underserved by the systems that we expect to support us, whether those be social services or governmental supports or schools or healthcare or the legal system. And all of that happens, that underserving happens prior to the commission of violence ever taking place. And those individuals who are often at the center of violence overwhelmingly have had extensive trauma in their own lives, as JT articulated. And there's great overlap between those who have suffered the harms of violence and those who go on to cause violent harm to other people. As I said, and as you read, James, these facts do not minimize the harm caused when people engage in bodily harm against other individuals. But as you noted, with that paraphrased quote from one of the CVI leaders I spoke with, pain and grief and rage are at the root of most of the community violence we see. And without genuine and effective outreach and engagement to address trauma and healing in individuals, families, and communities, and to break those cycles of violence, we cannot effectively and sustainably expect to reduce community violence. During my time in Baltimore, I also had the privilege of being introduced to community-based violence intervention through the leaders of Safe Streets, which is a CVI approach whose origins were based on Cure Violence, and it's where I had the pleasure of meeting the one and only JT. At the time, Safe Streets was the only sizable public safety strategy in Baltimore that did not rely on police to bring peace to communities. The driving forces behind Safe Streets, like all other CVI approaches, were relationships and transformation and hope. And so my research in CVI began with that work in Baltimore more than 10 years ago. And since my early days in the field, Baltimore, like many other cities across America, has begun to shift their public safety strategies to more centrally include community-based violence intervention and prevention approaches. My research has included hundreds of CVI professionals in Baltimore, Sacramento, Milwaukee, Oakland, Los Angeles, New York City, Chicago, Kansas City, Richmond, California, and more. And what I've learned, and others who have conducted research with CVI professionals have learned, is how vital this profession of CVI is to the safety and prosperity of families and communities, those that have been systematically affected by our continued failure to sustain peace in communities most harmed by interpersonal and structural violence. There are many different CVI models and theories of change, but all of them approach and recognize and respond to the fact that too many people who are at high risk of violence involvement have been alienated and disconnected from systems and structures that are supposed to offer support and care in our society. And those approaches seek to alleviate barriers to resources and services that can help provide security and stability to individuals and their families. As Brent and JT talked about, they do this by building and maintaining strong community ties, and even more intentionally, by building and maintaining relationships with those who are at highest risk of violence involvement and their loved ones. And CVI professionals serve as peer supports, as role models, and as bridge builders to connect individuals and their families to resources. The approaches rely on assets within communities to help stabilize the lives of those at the center of violence. And given the power of the relationship between the professionals and those they are seeking to engage, it's important to not only support that relationship building, but also for CVI approaches to have strong community partners in order to meet the needs of individuals with whom they engage. And that can be needs involving physical relocation for safety reasons, therapeutic services, legal aid, job training and placement, substance use disorder treatment, or even basic needs assistance like poverty and clothing. All of these approaches recognize that in the same way that trauma begets more trauma, healing begets more healing. So these approaches recognize and respond to trauma in supportive and healing-centered ways, while also acknowledging the community conditions surrounding the lives of their clients and participants. In a nutshell, while CVI approaches cannot by themselves undo the harms of systematic disinvestment in communities, or the harms of structural racism, or the complexities of poverty and lack of opportunity, what they do is they seek to mitigate those harms through relationships, through hope, through perseverance, and the deep-seated belief that change is possible with the right connections and supports. And CVI approaches build the bridges to connect individuals with those resources and to walk alongside individuals to guide, to uplift, to encourage, and to love on those individuals regardless of past transgressions. As Eddie began, his remarks talking about restoration, you hear redemption, you hear those ideas of transformation very much in the CVI space. And as Brent said, this is not about waiting 20 years to address poverty. It's about meeting people where they are right now and really engaging with them, walking alongside with them, loving on them, connecting them to resources, providing the kind of therapy, the cognitive behavioral therapy and awareness and education that JT talked about to really help change their lives. And there is increasing evidence that when those approaches are invested in with adequate resources, political will, and sustained support, they not only contribute to individual transformations, but they also contribute to violence reductions. So our ongoing challenges really rest with truly investing in these approaches with the financial, social, and human capital resources they need, including investing in the incredible professionals who are committed to the peace building and life-changing strategies that undergird CVI. And JT talked about workforce wellness that has come up increasingly in this space, and it's really hard to understate how powerful that is, the caring and support of the people who are doing this work that is too underfunded, too undersupported, but it is such hard work, and we have, in my opinion, for too long taken advantage of that hard work in a way that has not really uplifted the critical need to invest in the workforce doing this, because people are giving so much of themselves to do this work, and they must be supported to do it.
Thank you so much, Shani. And I see there's a bunch of questions already in the chat and the Q&A. Just as a reminder, we're going to be saving time for questions towards the end. I'll also be sharing with you links to TTA request forms, so please feel free, if we don't get to your question, to put it in the TTA request portal. Continuing this conversation, I want to go back to Brent. We've been talking about the what and the why of CVI. Let's start to address the how. In reflecting on the CVI definition, words like approach and multidisciplinary strategies were put there intentionally by experts that have been working in the CVI field for decades. As Chief Program Officer at Cure Violence, you've trained literally folks around the world using evidence-based public health strategy to detect and interrupt violence. Frequently, when LISC safety and justice teams, when we're engaging communities to advance this work, one of the first things that we hear is, oh, is that cure violence? So is CVI cure violence?
No, no. So, yeah, I mean, I think, a couple of things just to kind of address this question, because I think it's important. I mean, I think, just to piggyback on something that Dr. Bugs and JT was saying is, all of us, I think the city of Baltimore has really played a central role in this work and in this space. And myself met JT, when the program Safe Streets was starting, I had the great fortune to be sent out there for a couple of months as it was getting started in the health department. And I think, something that we learned and saw in Baltimore is one of the first cities that really took the cure violence approach, but thought about it in a context, right? In that, like, this is part of what the health department is doing. This is part of what the mayor's office is doing. This is part, like, how do we fit this approach into broader strategies? And so oftentimes, because cure violence was around for a while, and some of the evaluation, some of the evidence around this approach is based on the cure violence approach. I think sometimes it gets intertwined, and I don't think that's correct. I think the cure violence model and approach has a very specific lane that we can be helpful in. And oftentimes, especially in the last decade or so, when we're meeting with new cities, one of the first things we say is, like, we are not the solution, right? We can be part of a solution, but we are not the solution. And so what the cure violence, I think, can be most helpful with is really working with the immediate here and now, of working with those that are highest risk to be involved in violence, like right now, like today, tomorrow, next week. And it really has to do with kind of our three parts of our approach. One is interrupting the transmission. The second is preventing future spread. And then the third is really working to change group and community group norms around the acceptability of views and violence. And so for that first part of interrupting transmission, I mean, I think the idea of the interrupters in the film, I think, is pretty widely known and accepted as a practice across the US. But critical to it, right, is finding the right workers for the specific community that we're implementing the approach in. And so oftentimes when cities or organizations are starting, this is one of the harder parts of really kind of realigning the expectation of, like, who is best suited to this work. Is not just someone who's generally credible, but if we're working in, like, Ukrainian Village in Chicago, okay, who are the groups? You know what I mean? Who are the individuals have the relationships with the highest risk there, And so I think this is a critical component as jurisdictions and community groups are thinking about this, that, like, it's a highly specific workforce that needs to be recruited, trained, and then, like Dr. Bugs saying, like, actually supported to do this work. The second piece of the cure violence model, this preventing future spread, really has to do with more of the long-term work with individuals. And this is often not spoken about as much when it comes to cure violence, but it's a critical part of this, like, kind of street outreach, mentor slash, case management work, that, increasingly, and from a lot of folks on this call, has been definitely more trauma informed and learned a lot in the past, decade or so, of, like, how to actually do this. But that's really kind of the long-term work. And I think what outreach workers often find, and like what Dr. Bugs is saying, is, like, a lot of times there's not a lot of resources available. You know what I mean? And so we can't just say, okay, put down the guns, and then we're trying to do long-term work, and there's not a lot of places to provide actually supportive services or resources or actual, like, employment type things. And so I think there's been a lot of, like, great developments in the last 10 years, again, on some of that. And then the third part of, like, kind of changing group and community norms in a specific area. But like Eddie said, like, this is only one part of it. And I think for us, it's really important, when a city or a jurisdiction is thinking about CVI stuff, it's not just the interruption stuff. Like, that is a critical piece. And that is something that's, like, absolutely necessary to help create some of the conditions where violence has calmed down a bit. But really, this long-term work that JT has been working on and others have been working on, of how do we, and what Dr. Bugs said, which I love, is, like, how do we love on folks, like, to really support kind of over time, both healing some of their own internal, but then how are we engaging the external, right? And so it's like, we can talk about trauma all day long, but if there is not any viable economic opportunities anywhere, it becomes hard. I mean, I think about, we've had the extreme privilege to work in other countries and other spaces. And I think about our violence interrupters and outreach workers in Honduras, right? And San Pedro Sula and other areas where violence is really acute. There's literally no resource. There's nothing, right? And so it does limit kind of how far some of the reductions can be sustained over time, because there's just simply nowhere to go. And so it kind of changes the strategy a little bit. So, I mean, to your question, James, I mean, I think Cure-Violence is a specific thing, a specific lane, but all the lanes are necessary. And I think CVI work is not the solution either. It is a part and parcel, and it's got to be part of it. But if it is not attached to some of the things that Dr. Bugs and JT and others are talking about, it's not a real solution. It can be helpful, but it really needs to be connected to other things.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you. Yeah, you helped me really conceptualize this when you always talk about the yes and strategy. So,
yeah, and then one other thing I'll just say real quick. I mean, I think, like I said before, is like the early childhood intervention stuff. Yes, like the all the type of supportive services that are like that have been systematically taken away or never given to communities, like, has to be part of this long-term stuff. And so, but I just think when we think about some of the CVI work and some of the models or approaches underneath it, there are specific things, but it shouldn't be instead of, it should be in addition to other approaches and other ways that we're thinking about. So
yeah, and I think the other thing is it's got to be in community. If you have a public health organization or a public housing organization that's working on this but not connected to CVI organization, that's a big miss. So we got to have those partners also working in community, working together on this. All right, so we've got about 7 or 8 more minutes of panel time. I want to ask Eddie a question, and then we're going to open up to Q&A. So as much as I want to talk to you all for hours and hours, I do have 2 more questions, and then we'll kick it over to Eddie for a question and then open it up. So Dr. Bugs, I'm not going to make you follow JT again. I won't do that to you. Can you address some of the other strategies and research behind this work? So we talked a little bit about.
I'm sorry.
We talked a little bit about Cure-Violence and JT's CBT, and there's so many out there.
Right. There has been, thankfully, there are increasingly more and more strategies that use the CVI approach of connection, of relationship, of love and support and healing, and connection to resources and supports. But you have ROCA, you have Advanced Peace, there's Chicago CRED, there's the entire Chicago, the communities CP4P. I know the acronym. I can't recall exactly what. And it doesn't matter. Community Partners for Peace. That's it. You have a number of different strategies. Urban Peace Institute in Los Angeles, Crisis Management System in New York City. Like there are a bunch of different strategies that exist now intentionally, right? Because as JT said beautifully, you need to have different strategies for different communities. And while, thank you, Jordan, in the chat, while there are, different models, different theories of change, it's important for community members who are indigenous to the community, who have those relationships, can truly engage those who are at highest risk for violence involvement because they have those relationships and they understand the complexities of the lives of those who are at the center of violence. There has been a proliferation of research, although it is not nearly enough engaged research with the strategies that are existing to really understand how the strategies are implemented, how they work. But there has been more research done in the last 10, 15 years on these models. And one of the challenges around the research is that, as I said, the programs themselves are historically underfunded. They continue to be underfunded. If JT and Brent are nodding right now. If you talk to 100 CVI leaders across the country and ask them, do they have the resources to successfully employ the people who are doing this work? 100 will tell you no. People are not paid appropriately. They don't have the resources to take care of themselves. And so when more dollars are given to the programs, they want to invest in the people. They're not investing in data and research and evaluation, which makes total sense. And so what we need to be doing is then investing in the people and investing in research so that we can learn more about what these strategies are doing, how they're working, and ensure that we are supporting the strategies as best we can. The research does show that there are promising effects of CVI strategies, but also what we're learning from the research is the limitations around what happens when you have a standalone program that is intended to address all of the structural and environmental conditions within the community. And so, as Brent said, you have to have a both and approach if you're really thinking about how CVI can truly be successful. You have the folks who are at the center of the work who are engaging people at the highest risk of violence involvement. But then you also have the community partners, the organizations that they're connecting individuals to, that are providing the resources and supports. And if those organizations aren't equipped to work with the populations who are being engaged, if they're not equipped to adequately and expeditiously provide the services needed, then you have this breakdown in the true potential effectiveness of the CVI approaches. So there are a number of different strategies that exist, and increasingly there's been evidence to show Advanced Peace has had success, Chicago CRED has had success, Safe Streets has had success, ROCA's had success, Cure Violence has had success, but the context in which these programs are being implemented, and too often they are being implemented as programs, not as sustained strategies of the public safety fabric in the community. They're grant programs that are being given a couple of years of support, and then they're being held to these expectations. But did they drive down violence, at high levels in 2 years? And there's too much expected of a CVI program unless it's truly connected to all of these other supports that we know are critical in order to change the life trajectories of people who are at the center of violence. And when you talk about trauma, when you talk about, that going back to that one quote about grief and fear and rage, if you're not investing in truly changing what that looks like for people and their families, you're not going to see sustained reductions in violence. And so it's really critical for people to recognize that CVI is an approach, and it is a required approach. And it is especially a required approach for communities who do not just want more of the same. They have seen the harms and damage and the ineffectiveness of more of the same. We need to be investing in this, but we also need to invest in the research and invest in the workforce and invest in the community partners who are at the table with CVI, recognizing that all of those things are required if we're really going to change how these communities look, how the individuals who are at the centers of violence are supported and really offered true transformation.
Awesome. I was kind of smiling when you were talking there towards the end, because that was the point I was just about to make. Is that one of the most important things that JT said is that this work is a 4-year effort. It's 4 years. This is relationship-based work, and the expectations often in communities that fund this work are it's got to work in 6 months. It's got to work in a year. If you're going to create a CVI approach, an approach does not take 6 months. It takes years. So yeah, right on. JT, please take us home. Where do you see this work going over the next 5 years?
Oh man, the sky's the limit. The sky's the limit. The thing that makes me hopeful is that we've seen all this investment and all these opportunities to be able to expand the work, to really be able to give the work some structure, support, and sustainability. I think that we have a great opportunity here to actually really put a stamp on the importance of this work. But But we have to take it step by step. We have to do it the right way. We can't put the cart before the horse. Some things are going to be difficult. It's going to be tough to get there, but it should. This work is not easy, so it shouldn't be fun. It should be tough. It should be uncomfortable. And I hope that in the next 5 years or so, we can really have these uncomfortable conversations that really push the work forward. Because we're still not there. Because if we were, we still wouldn't be begging for money for these grassroots programs and begging for money for programs and things that we know work, right? So we have to be real about the elephant in the room, which is that we really have to keep pushing these uncomfortable conversations. Because on the other side, when we get through those uncomfortable conversations, on the other side is the birth of a lot of beautiful collaborations, a lot of things that have been missing from this work for so long. Right? We have to collaborate. We have to work together. We got to figure out. I love the yes and approach because that's what it's about. It's about, can Cure Violence be in the same city as Roca? Yes. And we can work together, right? It's about how can all these programs that look, we all operate in a similar field, but we do different things within that space. So people just automatically assume a lot of times that the CVI programs are the same or, without really understanding. But there is a lot of different models. There are a lot of different approaches. And I would encourage anybody, don't limit yourself to looking at one thing. Roca's not the end all, the be all. It's a tool. It's a piece of the puzzle, right? It's not the puzzle. It's not the whole solution, but it's a piece of the puzzle. And then lastly, I'll say, I think the stronger the workforce, the stronger the work, right? And for so long, we have been allowed to take context out of what happens to our workers because we see the stories on the news, a relapse and workers doing this, workers doing, but have they really been supported? Have we really given them a fair shot to change their lives? Have we really no, we told them they were a credible messenger and we had a job for them and they can go do this. But did we really give them the tools and the stuff to address their trauma and address the things that they need to be able to do this work in a healthy space? I ain't met a doctor yet that's in the operating room that ain't been to medical school. I hope I never meet one, right? Because that means there's a problem. So when it comes to this work, we have to think about our workers on the same level, which is why the Rewire CBT, I think, is really important because two things. It helps workers understand that you have a clinical tool, a tool that's looked at clinically in other places that you can actually use, and you're the teacher, right? So for all this time you've been taught you can't teach things, you can't do this, guess what? You can, and you can be better at it than most people who went to school for it, right? So helping build our workers' confidence in the work that they do, helping them understand the different avenues of the work. And I know I said lastly about 3 times, but this is really lastly. This is really lastly. Think about it. The more we build out the work, the more opportunity for promotion and growth there is for our workers within the work, right? So let's think about how do we build out the work so that we can have promotion opportunities for the people within the work, whether it be in the cities that they're working in, whether it be nationally, whatever it is. We need more people who've been doing this work on the grounds at moving up to this higher level of the work to really help inform this policy and, all this type of stuff, which is why having Eddie where he is just so much of an advantage for us. And it has been because we've seen that when people with knowledge are in those positions, things can happen.
Thank you all. And panel, please stick around for question and answers coming up very shortly. We're gonna work through the CVI Field Resource and Field Support Center. We're going to create opportunities for you to have additional conversations with folks like Dr. Bugs, Brent, JT, through I don't know what if we call them office hours or community practice sessions, but opportunities where you can hop on a webinar and ask a bunch of questions. So just because if you don't get your question answered this time, there'll be additional opportunities. All right, I'm going to share my screen again for a few moments and ask Eddie a question, and then we'll get to your questions. All right. So just a couple of takeaways that you all can think about. A lot of CVI too is about process steps, making sure you have strategies and resources that are engaging the right people. One of the things I loved what I heard is in order to do that, you have to listen to the community. You have to listen to each other. And part of that listening, you'd be able to identify and understand specific places where violence occurs. You're also able to identify gaps in community resources to make sure that the right partners are at the table. I know there was a number of folks in there talking about your work, the specific work that you're doing, and sometimes you might not feel like you're being included. If we have this work in community, there should be avenues to make sure that your work, your experiences are included and a full part of this process. And ultimately, we want to improve collaborative safety policies and protocols. So as far as next steps for the National CVI Resource and Field Support Center, this is going to be your go-to resource for communities seeking answers to violence and for policies and decision makers looking for replicable models. As we build out our website, you'll be able to access written guides highlighting various CVI models and strategies, fact sheets that inform action steps in the CVI checklist tool, case studies of successful efforts, webinar recordings, and more. It will include a calendar of events highlighting upcoming trainings, conferences, and even funding announcements. You'll be able to engage CVI experts with your questions around planning or evolving your CVI approach by requesting technical assistance support. And we want to showcase your work, the obstacles you overcame, the success stories of the lives you've changed through our community of practice. So while you are on our website, please join our community of practice, where you'll be able to connect with peers, engage, and build community with CVI organizations throughout the country. So here are some QR codes to the specific sites I mentioned. We're dropping these links into the chat as well. And I also want to alert you to 2 upcoming webinars. The first is focused on school-based CVI efforts that will be taking place later this week. So at first, I just want to encourage you to bookmark these links so you're able to stay tuned to upcoming CVI events and resources and connect with your peers. As far as the Friday's webinar, it will be focused on school-based CVI efforts. It's going to start at 1 o'clock Eastern. It's called Utilizing Data to Prioritize School-Based CVI Efforts. This webinar will highlight how schools can utilize the vast amounts of data they collect to help prioritize who and where to deploy CVI resources. We're going to be posting the registration link in the chat, and we're also posting the school-based CVI community of practice link. So if you're a school or engage in schools or want to engage with schools, I encourage you to join our school-focused CVI community of practice. Secondly, pay close attention to your emails for an upcoming webinar announcement for March 14th webinar, building out from today's conversation. My colleague Ryan Samuelson will be engaging leaders in Newark around examples of how cities and community-based agencies can work collaboratively to determine and prioritize the focused populations and geographies for CVI resources in a webinar entitled Person, Place, Thing, Understanding the Context of Community Violence. And before we move into questions from the field, I want to bring back Eddie Bocanegra to this conversation. Again, thank you for joining us in this webinar and your leadership, growing and educating others about the importance of this work. It seems like there's something new coming out about CVI on an almost daily basis. I know you touched upon Friday's Community Violence Intervention Leadership Academy graduation that took place at the White House with the Vice President and 31 graduates from cities across this country. I know you were there. Can you reflect a little bit on that event and how you see federal CVI resources provided through the Resource and Field Support Center supporting efforts, as we've spoken many times, to build out this bench?
Yeah, James, thanks for inviting me back into the conversation. Looking at the clock, and I don't have a lot of time, and there's a lot that I want to say here, but I think before I answer your question, let me just take a step back or two and kind of reflect on some of what our amazing panelists have shared. And I take away something JT just mentioned, right, around kind of the healthcare provider kind of language, right? You know, I think it's important for all those who are listening in right now on this call, right? Particularly those who are still trying to figure out, like, what's their role, how do they engage in this topic, trying to really build their understanding of this work. Well, one of the best scenarios that I could say is, think of it, if we were all, on this call, God forbid, had a stage 3 cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, which is one of the most common cancers, and we wanted to have some of the best surgeons to operate on us. Well, there's two things that I want to let people know. One is, there's a big difference between somebody who has predispositions cancer cells, or somebody who has a stage 1 cancer, meaning that the rigorous treatment they will receive is very different than somebody with a stage 3 cancer treatment, which means more money, more professionals, more expertise. And that also means that you're necessarily not going to beat cancer all the time. One of those cancers you might have about a 60% chance of beating it. Now, right now, the field is trying to build practitioners, experts, to be able to be those kind of physicians, so to speak, right? And we have a few, some on this call, that are sprinkled across this country that could actually do such a thing. Doesn't mean they're going to be right all the time. Doesn't mean they're going to be successful all the time. It means they figured out how to best leverage data and research, right? And they've been trained to do exactly that. Now, the field is still evolving, because unfortunately, as I pointed out, and many of us have pointed out this call, we have not truly invested in this work. And so really what that means is that we have, I wouldn't even say necessarily nurses out there doing operating on stage 3 cancer patients, right? It's like, we still need to even do that. And so it's really important for us to level set in the field of, we're just right now still building the infrastructure and the foundation of this work, which means that we have to give each other grace to be able to do that. Brent mentioned early childhood development. Well, for those who don't know, I did study under one of the folks that actually was a part of that early on. And I would tell you that early childhood development failed in the very beginning. And now we don't even question the importance of that work. And so this field needs to get to that point, but we need those who are on this call and others to really think about, like, how are we going to be able to elevate this kind of work? The same thing could be said for DV or veterans returning back from conflict with PTSD. It wasn't until like the early 2000s or 2005 or so that we started to better understand veterans who are being exposed to trauma. And now we even have another notion called moral injury, which is another kind of diagnosis that we have a better understanding. So what I'm pointing out here is that while we have some research and evidence to support the field, the work of what seems to be working, we need to do more of that, but we also need to build on that evidence that currently exists. And that's really important. So when I think about this past Friday's graduation, which was sponsored by the White House, Vice President Kamala Harris was able to speak there. Dr. Shani Bugs was there, JT. So there was an amazing group of people that were selected, 31 people, as you mentioned, to be part of this cohort, 6-month cohort out of the University of Chicago's crime lab. And the crime lab is parallel to bringing in CVI emerging leaders. They're doing the same thing on the law enforcement side. So they too recognize the importance of building and bridging these two kind of entities together to build exactly what Amy pointed out, this co-producer of public safety model, right? So that's one example that I would say we're doing. And DOJ is not necessarily supporting that financially, right? We just think that's part of our work, right? Like, how do we identify those things and how do we elevate those experiences and those models? But to me, again, I think about what took place there and how they're in a better position to lead the efforts in their respective cities, which is 21 cities that they're coming from. Last thing that I'll say around this, James, is that I think about my own success here at the Department of Justice. I started off as a street outreach worker. I went to do community organizing shortly after that. Then I became an executive director of the YMCA working with youth. And I think about all the programs that I created. Then I went to lead the efforts at Ready Chicago, the only program to date that I'm aware of that had a randomized controlled trial study with this high-risk population. And I want to say, like, there's a big difference between having after-school programs, right? It's a big difference when having those basketball leagues on a Friday night, right? Or tutoring programs, than working with those individuals that we consider to be non-social service seekers. And the folks that are on this call right now are explicitly talking about that population. And there's a population that is really misunderstood because we don't know enough about them. And what we do know right now is that they need a lot more service than we're able to provide, including what we are at DOJ are able to provide at this moment. But the hope that we're able to do more, and the hope is that we are able to build an ecosystem with all those who are on this call right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Man, there are so many really great questions out there, and unfortunately, we only have a few more minutes, so we're not going to get to them all. I do want to give you a preview of coming attractions, though. One of the questions was, when developing partnerships for a CVI initiative, who should be at the table and what should those partnerships look like? In a webinar post-April, we're going to have discuss that very question. So please stay tuned to that and check out our website for resources around partnership. We also had a question for a CVI program not accustomed to collecting data. How should we start the process of building out internal data collecting practices? We're going to touch on that in the March webinar, and we'll have a lot more resources around data for you at the website. These questions are all great. Please keep them coming. Definitely put them into the TTA request page. Those are going to help us inform what types of resources that we're providing to you. This is your website. So the more requests that we get, the more we can be very clear on the types and what resources we're providing you and through what format. Let's see about a question that we can actually answer here. This is a tough one. So I'll toss it out there. How do you create stakeholder buy-in when your area is very pro-law enforcement and anti-mental health and wants to make more arrests or stricter laws? So gotta start out with a really tough one. So anybody who wants to take that, go for it.
Got to create the buy-in. It's tough. When we first came to Baltimore, my boss told me like one of the things we had to do was find 5 cops I could trust. I said, well, good luck, because I don't trust none of them, right? But that was based on my personal experience and then based on what was happening at the time. But what we did was, and that's why we also created an adaptive version of our Rewire CBT called Rewire 4, that's adapted specifically for police officers. Because what we wanted to do was work closely with one of our toughest partners to help them realize the value in the collaboration, one, the value in the work, and two, to also change the narrative. Because, across the country, one of the biggest taboos about the CVI work is working with law enforcement. And how do you do that in a way that keeps fidelity and all that type of stuff? So, I mean, we've been fortunate enough to be able to really figure it out here, but it took a long time. Just as relentless as we were with our young people, we were relentless with law enforcement. Like, no, can you meet with us? No, we better not. Well, can you meet with us? Just kept on them. No, we need you to come see this. We need you to understand what we're doing, right? We really tried to, and it doesn't work all the time. It doesn't. I'll be honest, it doesn't work all the time. But it's really a battle of persistence. Like how much, in some places, how much you're willing to keep at it until they finally listen to you, or finding the right person within law enforcement or within that collaboration who really gets it or really understands it or wants to understand it. Like, I will tell you that we found some great partners in our law enforcement community that really get it, and it shocked me. But they exist, and you have to, be consistent with it.
And can I just add to what JT said? I think it is, when you look at like this University of Chicago, the leadership academies, that you have police and the CVI leadership academy going on at the same time. And what the leaders of the police leadership academy recognize the value of CVI. There are, as JT just said, there are many supporters within the law enforcement community who recognize that CVI is needs to be a critical part of the public safety infrastructure, because there are just strategies that the police will never be able to achieve in communities that have been disengaged, disinvested, disconnected, really isolated from safety structures and supports. And so, looking at the DOJ and looking at the DOJ's support for CVI, I think is a testament to the fact that you can identify credible messengers in the law enforcement space who really appreciate and understand the need to include CVI in the public safety infrastructure. But it is challenging, it is hard, and it's about perseverance and finding those right champions as they come along, as JT said.
That's part of those uncomfortable conversations I was talking about. That's a perfect example of one.
JT, Dr. Bugs, Brent, thank you very much. You set the bar high, and we're gonna try to maintain this high standard during future events. I also want to take a quick second to thank Amy and Eddie again for joining the webinar, and my teammates Ryan and LeVar, who were helping answer questions and directing questions as well. So thank you all. Please stay in touch with our website and our team, and I appreciate everything that you all are doing in the field. We need you all, we need all of us to do this important work. Thank you. Take care.